In the eventful summer of 1863, a cavalry raid by Confederate Brigadier General John Morgan brought the Civil War to southern Indiana and Ohio. Morgan's men entered southwestern Ohio on July 13th of that year. Well, I'm here to explore this area and look for traces of that long-ago raid. Come on, let's go chase Morgan once again. Though he didn't often use his middle name, history would come to know him as John Hunt Morgan. Born in Huntsville, Alabama in 1825, he was the oldest of 10 children, and the family would eventually make Lexington, Kentucky, their home. He served in the U.S. Cavalry during the Mexican-American War, and in the years just prior to the Civil War, formed a militia unit called the Lexington Rifles. After the war started, he and his unit joined the Confederacy. He was made colonel of the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry just in time to see the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. He went on his first of several raids through Kentucky the following July. He captured so many Union soldiers, horses, and supplies that Kentucky's Union government began to panic. His successful raid is considered one of the key reasons that Confederate armies in the region decided on a full-scale invasion of Kentucky, though they would eventually have to withdraw back to Tennessee. By June of 1863, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General Braxton Bragg, was facing potential threats from multiple Union forces. The Union Army of the Cumberland, led by General William Rosecrans, was nearby. A sizable Federal cavalry, led by General Henry Judah, was in Kentucky, and Union General Ambrose Burnside was in Cincinnati, putting together a new army to take to Tennessee. General Bragg needed some breathing space while he moved his army to a better location. Morgan, now a brigadier general of his own cavalry division under Bragg, suggested that Morgan go on another raid into Kentucky to divert Federal attention away from Bragg's army. Bragg approved, but was unaware that Morgan would be taking almost 2,500 men with him out of a total of roughly 2,700, and that Morgan intended to go north of the Ohio River. Bragg would never have approved had he known this. Morgan was reluctant to leave his second wife of only 6 months, who was expecting their first child. However, he felt the raid was necessary, not only to help Bragg, but to give the North a small taste of what Union soldiers had been doing to Southern civilians. Not only had Federal forces in the South done a great deal of looting and vandalism, civilians had been harassed, arrested, and occasionally even hanged. Morgan began crossing his men over the rain-swollen and treacherous Cumberland River in southern Kentucky on the evening of June 30th. After crossing, he would fight a series of engagements in Kentucky, cross the Ohio River with commandeered steamboats into Indiana, and fight still more skirmishes. At that point, he was also being chased by Union cavalry under Union Brigadier General Edward Hobson. Nearing the end of his time in Indiana, Morgan encamped a few miles south of Sunman on the evening of Sunday, July 12th. Meanwhile, there was a train full of militia along with Union General Lew Wallace in the Sunman area, who knew nothing of Morgan being nearby. The following day, Morgan would enter into Ohio and its danger zone, the area around Cincinnati, where there would be the greatest concentration of Union troops and abundant railroad trains and track to rapidly deploy them with. By dawn, Monday, July 13, 1863, Morgan's men were in the saddle again. It would be another day and a half before they would get any real rest. During that time, they would ride hard. struggled to follow their assigned routes, especially at night, burned several bridges and tried to burn several more, plunder towns and homes, especially of any available horses, and fight several skirmishes along the way. They would deal with heat, humidity, insects, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Those that kept going through it all showed incredible willpower. They had reached their absolute limits physically. They passed through the crossroads of Hubbell's Corner and then on to the German Catholic town of New Alsace, where they confiscated the local priest's team of horses while he was inside conducting Mass. When they left town, Union cavalry were only a few hours behind. After New Alsace, they next went through Dover with a newly acquired beer wagon, confiscated from a brewery. On the way to Logan, the next town, they stopped a hearse on its way to a burial and swapped 2 jaded mounts or very tired horses for those of the undertakers. After Logan, they were on the last stretch before Ohio. Shortly before noon on an already hot Monday morning, Morgan's troops were riding down this road, past this cemetery, heading to the Whitewater River and the last of Indiana, which Morgan was glad to be leaving. 4 of Morgan's 5 younger brothers started out with him on the raid. After his brother Tom was killed in a firefight with Union troops in Lebanon, Kentucky, Morgan began to turn more of a blind eye to looting by his men. Morgan's younger brother Key had not come along. Additionally, Morgan's second-in-command and colonel of his 1st Brigade, Basil Duke, had become his brother-in-law when he married Morgan's sister Henrietta, who had the curious nickname of Tommy. Also, Morgan's sister Catherine, nicknamed Kitty, was married to famed Confederate General A.P. Hill, who had served under Robert E. Lee. In this general area, Morgan's men crossed to the left and rode down onto the heavy oak-covered bridge across the Whitewater River. The bridge was necessary because the river was much deeper back then, due to it being dammed downstream. Once Morgan's men finished crossing the bridge, they burned it, as the dust from the approaching Union cavalry could be seen off in the distance. Further down the road, near the present-day concrete bridge, this interpretive sign can be found. It describes Morgan's entry into Harrison and the subsequent looting. Just south of this one-time school building, Morgan's men came out onto what was then Main Street, where Indiana and Ohio met. In the parking lot of the old school are the last of the interpretive signs for the Morgan Trail in Indiana. It's believed that Morgan had about 2,000 men left at this point, out of his original 2,500. On a street a short distance down the road is what was once the red brick Barry Simonson house. A corn crib behind the home fed a lot of rebel horses that day. On this street corner of what is now State and Harrison Streets is the last of the old stone Morgan plaques in Indiana. At this location, Morgan's men would leave Indiana for good. They now entered Ohio, and some of them would stay permanently. From about noon to about 3 p.m., Morgan's men went on a looting spree in Harrison. William Vincent's bakery was located here. Being hungry, the raiders visited here early on. In 1863, this was the American House Hotel, which served as Morgan's headquarters while staying in Harrison. His room was on the 3rd floor, the 3rd and 4th windows from the left. In 1889, the building was enlarged, but you can still see the original section with its lighter colored bricks. Just down the street, in front of Harrison's fire department, is the first Ohio Morgan Trail interpretive sign. In 1863, the building that stood here was the market house, which housed a store and a post office. Morgan's men visited both. At the post office, Morgan's telegraph operator sent false messages that Morgan was heading towards Cincinnati, or nearby Hamilton. Morgan also spread similar rumors among the townspeople. Morgan was hoping to make General Burnside in Cincinnati send troops to the wrong places. He did succeed in causing great confusion among Burnside and his staff. This was George Becker's grocery store at the time. The store had been locked, but the raiders just broke through the door and helped themselves. Becker himself was stopped on the road by raiders and was robbed of his cash and his watch. This building was a tavern, and you can bet the raiders visited here. The owner's corn also went to feed the horses of federal troops later as they were pursuing Morgan. After demanding and receiving $1,000 from each of 3 local mill owners in exchange for not burning their mills down, Morgan's men began leaving Harrison close to 3 p.m. From Harrison, they rode east, the main column of troops heading toward the next town of New Haven. But Morgan also sent about 500 men southeast to Miamitown, where they were to burn the covered bridge over the Great Miami River. However, when those men arrived, they ran into a detachment of scouts and local militia who fired on them, inflicting several casualties. The raiders rode on without getting the bridge burned. The main column headed east to New Baltimore, as always fanning out on parallel roads, both to raid more farms and to make it harder for the federal troops to follow them. Also, Morgan sent another detachment to the northeast to try to convince Union General Burnside that he was going to attack the city of Hamilton to the north. He actually sent the men to burn the bridge at Venice, Ohio, but also hoped to deceive the Yankees in the process. For whatever reason, the raiders didn't get Venice's bridge burned. Both detachments met back up with the main column further east. The main column did get the almost brand new covered bridge at New Baltimore burned and continued east. Eventually, they linked up with the other detachments near this marker's location on Monday evening. Morgan's men continued east, beginning one of the longest nights of their lives. There was no moon and torches were not allowed, so it was a nightmare for the different units to follow each other, especially when the fork in the road was reached and they had to determine which road the forward column had taken. Compounding all this was the fatigue and hunger many of them felt. At the old St. Mary or Presbyterian cemetery near Springdale, 2 of the exhausted raiders stopped for what was planned to be a short nap. When they woke up, it was morning, and to their dismay, armed local citizens were staring at them. They were taken prisoner, and the raid was over for them. Meanwhile, word came in from scouts that Cincinnati was in a state of great confusion. Union General Burnside was unsure where to send troops, as Morgan was quite good at deception. Additionally, Burnside was worried that the recent New York draft riots would flare up in Cincinnati, and his troops would be needed to restore order. And if that wasn't enough, the Army's General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, in Washington, kept sending telegraphs to Burnside questioning why Burnside hadn't taken his forces to Tennessee yet. He ignored Burnside's repeated explanations that he couldn't leave while Morgan was still operating in Ohio. Morgan's men rode into Glendale in the early hours of Tuesday, July 14th. Morgan had feared that Union troops, arriving by train, would be waiting for him. However, his feint toward Hamilton had worked. Just a half hour earlier, a train full of soldiers from Cincinnati had passed by, on their way toward Hamilton. The original train depot is gone now, replaced by this building on the original site. While the raiders were tearing up the rails at the depot, Morgan's telegraph operator George Ellsworth used the depot's telegraph to send more misleading messages. The depot today is the home of the Glendale Historical Society. Among its exhibits are items related to the raid. This house once belonged to Colonel C.W. Moulton, brother-in-law to Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. This was the Harkness home in 1863. They actually hid their carriage horses in that little smokehouse on the left. The raiders continued east to the town of Sharon, now called Sharonville, arriving between 3 and 4 a.m. The 12-Mile House was the Sharon Hotel, run by a known Confederate sympathizer. Morgan's men gave him the opportunity to contribute to the cause by having him serve them food, drink, cigars, and then taking his horse. At this point, Morgan divided his two brigades up and sent Duke's 1st Brigade to the east, toward Montgomery, and Johnson's 2nd Brigade to the south. Morgan traveled with Johnson. To the southwest lay a Catholic boarding school where none other than one of General Sherman's daughters, 12-year-old Minnie, was staying. The sisters at the school had advance warning and hid their horses before the raiders got there. Another of the 2nd Brigade's raiding parties came across the Brown family farm, now called the Gorman Heritage Farm. The farm was operated by the village of Evendale as a public educational site. Here is the spring house, used to store food and as a source of water. The raiders made use of both. This is the original banked barn that raiders removed 2 horses from. It's the only barn that Morgan's men visited north of the Ohio River that is open to the public. Mr. Brown got one of his horses back, but it suffered from the effects of hard use. In nearby Blue Ash is another publicly owned raider site. This home was owned by the Hunt family. In its barn were 6 horses, and the raiders took all 6. Mr. Hunt told his 10-year-old son that there wasn't much he could do, as you can't stop an army. Going south a bit, in the area that was then called East Sycamore, was the John Schenck farm. According to reports, this was one place where the master of deception was himself deceived. The story is that the Schenck family hurriedly took their prized carriage horses and a family of escaped slaves and hid them in their parlor, and then covered the windows. When the raiders arrived, A family member dressed in a nurse's outfit came to the door and explained that a child sick with smallpox was inside. The raiders weren't about to risk becoming infected themselves, and so contented themselves with having breakfast in the yard. Reportedly, Morgan himself stopped to eat. It was nearing dawn when they left, never knowing they had been tricked. The 2nd Brigade continued working its way east toward a Union Army post called Camp Denison at the eastern edge of Hamilton County. The camp was also a mustering point for raw recruits, but was mainly the largest Union Army hospital in Ohio. The site was close by a settlement called Germany, Ohio. This lithograph shows the hospital barracks lined up along the left, railroad tracks running north and south down the center, and the Little Miami River along the far right. The commander of the camp, Lieutenant Colonel George Neff, had been preparing for Morgan. He had trees down across roads approaching the camp and rifle pits dug on hillsides surrounding it. He also sent men to guard nearby bridges. Up ahead, Morgan's men found trees laying across the road, and also encountered rifle fire from the rifle pits in the hillside now obscured by these trees. With Union cavalry chasing him, Morgan could not afford a drawn-out battle, so he backed the 2nd Brigade up and they backtracked their way to Montgomery, where they would rejoin Basil Duke's men. If we continue on, we eventually come to this small park with monuments to the camp and informational plaques. Well worth a visit. Nearby, the Christian Waldschmidt House serves as a museum and welcome center. Meanwhile, Morgan, with Johnson's brigade, met up with Basil Duke at Montgomery and made their way east to the Little Miami River. When they crossed it, they were in Clermont County. It was roughly 7:30 a.m. Tuesday, July 14, 1863. The men had not had any real sleep for over 24 hours. Morgan set up headquarters in a farmhouse in the area. On what is now a peaceful bike path were once the tracks for the Little Miami Railroad. Morgan's men cut its telegraph wires and loaded a cattle guard with cross ties just beyond a bend so the train engineer wouldn't see it in time to stop. The train, loaded with troops bound for Camp Denison, headed south toward the bend. The raiders fired at it, causing the engineer to run the throttle wide open. The engine and the following tender car derailed, but miraculously the troop car stayed on the track. The train's engineer was badly hurt, and the fireman killed. The approximately 150 Union troops were captured and marched to Morgan's headquarters to be paroled. Further south, where the modern-day bike trail meets the Little Miami River, are two Morgan Trail interpretive signs, the first describing the train derailment incident, and the second describing the skirmishes that took place in the area with Union forces. The town of Miamisville, or Miamiville as it's now called, is just across the Little Miami River from Camp Denison, so Camp Commander Neff was able to post men at bridges in the area of the town. The train derailment having already occurred, Duke's 1st Brigade headed south toward Miamiville. They came across a small Union guard at the Madisonville Pike Bridge, playing cards. They captured one of the guards and drove the rest off. They held the bridge while the rest of Duke's brigade passed by. Today, stone abutments are all that remain of that bridge. Duke's real objective was to burn the railroad bridge south of town After a sharp skirmish, they drove off the Union guards and were attempting to start a fire when Union reinforcements arrived, and a firefight erupted for the next few hours. The raiders never were able to destroy the bridge. At one point, they set up artillery and shelled the Union forces around the bridge and at Camp Dennison, but neither had much effect. Eventually, another Union detachment struck from the west using the Madisonville Pike Bridge, and the raiders eventually withdrew. They headed east, and once the adrenaline settled, exhaustion returned among the men. It would be mid-afternoon before Morgan felt safe enough to let the men in camp and finally get some real rest. Along the way, there would be further adventures, but we'll save that for another time. This was the home of Moses Robinson. Whatever Confederate sympathies he may have had probably were lost when Morgan's men left with one of his horses and much of his grain. Finally, we stop at the Evergreen Cemetery in Miamiville to visit the graves of John and Catherine Anderson. John had met young Catherine when he and another raider stopped at the Deerwester farm to the east. Catherine and her mother made a meal for them. By the time he left, John told Catherine that after the war he would come back and marry her, and that's exactly what he did. By the way, this happened several times in both Ohio and Indiana. Well, all's fair in love and war. Thanks for watching.